Okay, so it has started recording. So let's start the class. So we are meeting after the weekend, and what did we do last time? We so last to last class we did the topological preliminaries like Urizon's lemma and all that. Yeah, so Akshay also has joined. All that that was last to last class. And last class, we basically stated the Rees representation theorem and did a few small things about it. And I also told you that it's a long proof in Rudin, 5 pages and 10 steps. And we will start the proof today and we will continue the proof in the next class. And maybe, I'll go a bit slow and extend the proof even to one more class. I can finish it by today and tomorrow, but let's not do that. Okay, we will go slow. Okay, so let me share the screen. And as usual, one of you please confirm that you can see the slides.
Yes, sir, we can see.
Okay, great. So today is also RRT. To my next class also will be RRT, and probably the next class also will be RRT. Okay. So as I told you, which race is this? F or M?
F.
F, yeah. And M. Rees is also a famous mathematician, Marcel Rees. I just looked at his Wikipedia. He is famous for contributions in partial differential equations and all that. I thought I'll mention this because I remember many of you telling that your interests are in partial differential equations. So you will see more of, not more, but you will also see Marcel Rees. Okay, not in this course maybe. So good. So let's continue. And as I said last time, we started RRT, proved the uniqueness of mu part. And basically, this was an argument using Urison. And we also saw that the measure is complete. And we also listed all the 10 steps and we will go through that. So I think today I'll try to cover 3 or 4. I would like to cover 4 steps. Okay, that's what I have typed. So let's start with step 1. No, I'm very interested in the following. Whenever I teach whatever course, how to remember these long proofs. So partly, it is understanding it properly, but maybe that's not good enough. Even if we understand, yeah, what is understanding properly? That also, is not so clear. But anyway, I mean, different tools for remembering will be useful. Anyway, you have to see which way you will remember. Of course, maybe you don't have to remember it also after some time. I don't know. Anyway, step 1. So I will nickname my steps so that I remember it like that. Step 1 is subadditivity. What is subadditivity? What is additivity? If disjoint union is there, then measure of the union. See, I will continuously call this mu a measure. Sometimes I'll put quote marks because we are yet to prove it's a measure, but I will use that term. Okay. So additivity is mu of union is summation of mu of EI. Uh, if EI is a disjoint, and subadditivity is disjointness is not required, but it's less than or equal to. So let's start the proof. The key input is partition of unity. Okay. So what we are going to do is see, you want to prove that mu of union EI is less than or equal to summation of mu EI. Okay. Union EI is I is 1 to infinity. Now, if you are planning to prove such a thing for an infinite union, what is your first thing to try? If you are hoping to prove something for an infinite union, subadditivity, where will you test it first? Even before going to infinite for finite, right? Agree?
Yes, sir.
And finite is same as 2, right? By induction. Okay. So you would like to test it for 2 sets. And the way in which we have defined this mu, what was our starting point? We defined it using open sets, right? We defined it for open sets. And then we put outer regularity as the definition for other sets, right? So if this is true, we should be able to prove it for 2 open sets first. So let's start with 2 open sets V1 and V2. And what should I prove? Mu of V1 and V2 are any two open sets, and what should I prove? Mu of
V1 union V2 less than equal to mu of V1.
mu of V1 plus mu of V2. Okay, so that's what we are going to aim. And suppose G precedes V1 union V2. What does this mean? This means G is continuous compact support, values between 0 and 1, and support of G is contained in V1 union V2. I'm not saying there is such a G. Of course, there is such a G, but that's not my claim. Take such a G if it is there. Okay, and for all such G, we will prove something. So apply partition of unity. You remember partition of unity, right? It's a corollary and generalization of Urysohn. And whenever a compact set is contained inside a finite union of open sets, you can construct CCX functions in a particular way. So we are going to apply it to the compact set is support of G. Okay, support of G is compact, G is CCX. Continuous function of compact support. And what are your open cover or the subordinate to the cover? V1 comma V2. So what will you get? Do you remember partition of unity? You will get functions H1 and H2. What are the properties? H1 precedes V1 and H2 precedes V2 and
H1x plus H2x equal to 1 in
yeah. So
K.
H1 plus H2 is identically 1 on K. So you will get HI precedes VI, H1 plus H2 is 1 on support of G, which is K. Okay. Therefore, do you agree that HIG precedes VI, H1G precedes V1 and H2G precedes V2? Because H1 precedes V1. So support of H1 is contained in V1. Therefore, support of H1 times anything is contained in, no. Yeah, support of H1 is contained in V1. So outside V1, H1 is 0. So H1 times anything also is supported in V1, right? Because if H1 is 0, then H1 times anything will be 0 outside. Clear? So H1G is contained in V1 and H2 not contained in H1G precedes V1, H2G precedes V2, and you can write G as H1G plus H2G, right? Because if G is 0, then both sides are 0. If G is not 0, then it's inside the support. Inside the support, H1 plus H2 is identically 1. Therefore, you can write it like this. What will be the next step? We are planning to do something mu of V1 union V2. What is the definition of mu of V1 union V2? It is supremum of. What is the definition of mu of an open set? I mean, in this proof.
Supremum of.
Yeah. The values of that positive linear functional, right?
Lambda f.
Lambda f, where f precedes v. So here we are starting with G. G precedes V1 union V2. So mu of Vi will be supremum of lambda f. F precedes Vi. Correct? This is the definition. And this is bigger than or equal to lambda of Hij, right? Because lambda of Hij, this is the least upper bound of such things, and lambda of Hij is one element here, and this is an upper bound. So this is bigger than or equal to lambda of Hij. You agree? It's an upper bound. So of anything here, and Hij belongs here. So this is bigger than or equal to lambda Hij. This you know. And if you take lambda G, this is same as lambda H1G plus lambda H2G, right? Because lambda is a linear functional and G is H1G plus H2G. But lambda of H1G is less than mu V1 and other one is less than mu V2. So this is less than or equal to mu V1 plus mu V2. Okay. So what have you concluded? You have concluded that whenever G precedes V1 union V2, lambda G is less than or equal to mu V1 plus mu V2. So what is your conclusion? What is mu of V1 union V2? Mu of V1 union V2 is supremum of lambda G, such lambda G, right? So for any such G, lambda G is less than or equal to this. Therefore, will you say supremum is also less than or equal to this? For all G, lambda G is less than or equal to this. Therefore, the supremum of lambda g is also less than or equal to this, right? Agree?
Yes.
Therefore, you have concluded this is true for any such g, and therefore you have got mu of v1 union v2 is less than or equal to mu of v1 plus mu of v2. Therefore, do you agree that mu of v1 union v2 union v3 is less than or equal to mu of v1 plus mu of v2 plus mu of v3? And for any finite union, this is true, right? By induction. So now we are going to we need to show that mu of a countable union is less than or equal to summation of mu ei. This is our aim. And for this, we are going to show that mu of v is strictly less than summation mu ei, this right hand side sum, plus epsilon. And where are we going to show this? What is v and where are we going to show this? So I'm going to show this for every epsilon. I will show this for some v containing union ei. Is that's enough? No? If I can show this displayed inequality for all epsilon and for some v open set containing union ei. So union ei is contained in v. So if union ei is contained in v, I will get mu of union ei is less than or equal to this. And if this is strictly less than this for all epsilon, then I get that is less than or equal to this. Agree? So this is what we aim to show for all epsilon and for some open set containing ei. Now, can you give me a natural open set containing union ei? I mean, how do you construct a natural open set containing union ei? Take open sets containing ei and take their union, right? That's one natural way of agree. Take open set vi containing ei and take union vi. That will contain union ei, right? And open sets containing ei will naturally come when you look at mu of ei. So first of all, we can assume that mu of ei is finite for all I. Why is that? This is without loss of generality. Because these are easy steps. Somebody can tell me. Why is this?
Infinite.
Yeah, if one of them is infinite, then RHS is infinite and everything is less than or equal to infinite. So the inequality is automatically true. So we can assume this. And if mu of ei is finite, what is the definition of mu of ei? An arbitrary set, how is measure defined?
Infimum of v where v is an open set containing ei.
Correct. Infimum of mu of vi, where vi is an open set containing v is an open set containing ei. Mu of v contains ei and v open, right? This is true. And this is infimum is greatest lower bound, right? So if you take mu ei plus something, that is not a lower bound, right?
Yes, sir.
Ei plus something, that is not a lower bound. And that means you will get a vi such that mu of ei plus epsilon is not a lower bound. So you will get a vi such that mu of vi is even lower, no? So mu of vi is less than mu of ei plus something, right? You will get such a vi. So take that vi. So for given epsilon, there exists vi containing ei open such that mu of vi is less than mu of ei, and in this proof I have taken epsilon by 2 power I. Okay. So you agree with this? Mu of ei plus something is not a lower bound because this is the greatest lower bound, and therefore there is a vi satisfying all these conditions such that mu of vi is lower. Agree? Can I go to the next slide?
Yes, sir.
Okay. So now what are you going to do? But yes. So you have this. And what do I know? I know I know something about mu of v1 union, v2 union, etc. Finite unions, I know something, right? Finite unions, I know something. So somehow I want a finite case. So take v to be the full union and then take f preceding v. Okay, if f precedes v, then do you agree that f precedes v1 union, etc. union vn for some n? Why is this true? What is one word which will show this? What is a keyword?
Support of F is compact.
Yeah, support of F is compact. So this means support of F is contained in V, and V is this union, and support of F is compact. Therefore, there's a finite cover. And whatever finite cover you get, take n larger than that so that it's contained in this union. So F precedes this, and this is good because by compactness of support of F, therefore lambda F, what can you say about lambda F? Lambda F is how is mu defined? Mu is the supremum of lambda F, right? So lambda F is less than or equal to mu of V1 union etc. union Vn, right? Because F precedes this. And what do you know about this? Mu of V1 union etc. union Vn from whatever we have proved?
Less than is equal to mu
Less
of
than equal
V1
to
plus.
summation of this, right? And now what will you use? You will use what we concluded in the last slide, right? These VIs are chosen in a precise way. VIs are chosen so that mu Vi is less than
Mu of Vi plus
epsilon by 2 power I. So this is less than mu E1 plus etc. plus mu En plus epsilon by 2 plus epsilon by 2 square plus etc. epsilon by 2 power 4. So you agree that this is less than mu E1 plus etc. plus mu En plus epsilon, right? Because 1 by 2 plus etc. 1 by 2 power n is less than 1. So this is less than that, and which is less than the full union. So do you agree that this is less than or equal to summation mu ei up to infinity plus epsilon? This is clear, no? Because this much is less than mu ei summation 1 to n plus epsilon. But 1 to n is less than 1 to infinity because these are all positive numbers. Okay, so you get this. So what have we done? We have done that whenever f precedes v, we have shown that lambda f is less than or equal to this. So what is the conclusion? And this is true for all epsilon. So what is the conclusion? Whenever f precedes v, yeah, so mu of v is supremum of such lambda f. And all these lambda f is less than or equal to this. So the supremum is also less than or equal to this. So mu v, this is true for any f preceding v, and therefore mu v is less than or equal to this. Is this enough? Are we done? We are done, right? Because this is what we were aiming to show, right? I wanted to show that there is a v such that mu v is less than this. So that's what we have shown. There is a v such that v contains union ei, and that's what we wanted. And such a v, we had to show that mu v is less than or equal to summation mu ei plus epsilon. And this is true for all epsilon. Okay. Is there any step that I should explain again, or this is okay? Subadditivity is okay. Of course, you have to read it once more. You have to go through it once more. But what was the basic idea in subadditivity? Why don't you tell me one or two things to remember? What is the most important idea? Most important, I don't know, but what are one or two important ideas? What all did we use? First of all, in order to show for an infinite union, you have to show for union of two things, and we were showing union of two open sets. And this is natural because any set measure is defined in terms of open sets. And having shown that, in order to show the infinite thing, we were taking a good open set containing union ei, and we were showing that mu of v is less than summation mu ei plus epsilon for any epsilon. And we chose vi using the definition of mu of ei, and chose the union of those vi's, that is natural, and then argued with an f preceding v. Right? And this was the main point. And remember some of these things, all these things will be today, we are going to do 4 steps. Okay. And the 4th step, we are going to show additivity. Okay. Right now, we have shown subadditivity. In step 4, we will show additivity. But we are not going to show additivity on our final sigma algebra. You remember final sigma algebra came via an intermediate step, no? What was the notation of that intermediate step? Final sigma algebra is M. And what is this said before that?
MF.
MF. And that's not a sigma algebra. We are not claiming that. M is a sigma algebra. And on this MF, we are going to show additivity. Okay, that is step 4. And remember, in subadditivity, we used open sets. And everything is symmetrical. You have open from above and compact from below. And in step 4, we will use compact sets from below in order to show additivity for MF. Is that natural? Do you agree that in general we will use open sets, and if we are dealing with MF, we will use compact sets? Is that natural? What do you say? General arguments will be via open sets, and arguments particular for MF will be via compact sets. Why is that? Why is it natural?
Because mu is inner regular for
Yeah,
finite measures.
correct. So MF is defined using inner regularity, right? And general outer regularity is there. So general arguments will be most likely via open sets, and arguments about MF we will use compact sets. But that will be that will reflect this argument in step 1. Step 1 we finally did it for 2 open sets. So similarly, what will you do in step 4 finally? Will be for 2. See, we are going to show additivity. Mu of union EI is summation mu EI whenever EI belong to MF. But instead of EI, what will be the first step? We will do it for 2 things and 2 compact sets which are disjoint. Absolutely. Okay, so just keep that in mind. But before that, let us do step 2. Step 2 is about compact sets, and step 3 is about open sets. You will always see this compact open jugalbandi. Okay, I mean they are intermingling, and we will use compact from below and open from above. Sometimes open from above, sometimes compact from below. Go back and forth, and that's how this proof is built. So step 2 is about compact sets. Step 3 is about open sets, and using whatever we have done till then, step 4 will be about additivity, but only in MF. And there we will stop today. So compact sets, recall that MF consists of those sets of finite measure. Measure, once again, I put in quote unquote because we haven't proved it's a measure, which are inner regular. So we claim that compact sets belong here. Now, in order to show that compact sets belong to MF, what do we have to show? Inner regular, there's nothing to show, right? Because what is inner regular? E is inner regular if mu of E is supremum of mu of K compact contained inside E. But if E is compact, then E itself is there, no? So that's automatic, right? So compact sets are inner regular by definition. There's nothing to show. So what is the crux of this argument? When we have to say that a compact set belongs to MF, what is the only thing that we need to prove? Because inner regularity, there's nothing to prove. Yeah, tell me once again.
Mu of K is finite.
Yeah, that's all that we need to show, because inner regularity is automatic by the very definition. Okay, so that's what I have written in plain English. Inner regularity is obvious by the very definition. So only finiteness to be checked. So that's what step 2 is. So step 2, we are going to show finiteness. Do you agree that it's enough to show this for some F? If I can exhibit an F such that mu K is less than or equal to lambda F, then finiteness is shown, no? Because what is lambda? Lambda is a, no, is that argument correct? What was my lambda?
Lambda is a positive
linear functional.
Yeah, but it's valued in complex numbers, right?
No, it is in closed interval 0 to infinity.
No. Okay, either I am wrong or you're wrong, but I believe lambda is a complex linear functional because our vector space. Where is our linear functional? On which vector space have we defined our linear functional? CCX, right?
It's a complex linear functional, but its image inside the positive real axis.
Yes, positive real axis. Infinity is not part of it.
Yes,
No,
yes.
images. No. Image is not contained in. No. It is a complex linear functional. Period. Nothing more. Okay. The word positive means something else. It doesn't mean image is contained in that. So let's go back and recall. I'm also recalling as I speak. CCX is a complex vector space, and therefore the natural linear functional to consider is a complex linear functional, and lambda is a complex linear functional. The extra word which I had underlined is positive, but we define what is the meaning of a positive linear functional. What does that mean? If f is positive, then lambda f is positive. This does not mean that the image of lambda is contained in positive real axis. Do you see the difference?
Yes, sir.
Because lambda f can be any complex number if f is not real valued. F can be complex valued, no? F can be general complex valued, in which case lambda f is also some arbitrary complex number. So positive meaning if f is real valued, and moreover if f is positive real valued, non-negative real valued, then lambda f is non-negative real valued. This is the meaning of positive. Okay. So lambda f is always finite by the very definition. It's valued inside complex numbers, and therefore this is enough, no? If I can exhibit f such that mu k is less than or equal to lambda f, then I am done, right? Agree? Because lambda f is always finite, therefore mu k is finite. Is there a problem?
No, sir.
Okay, so this is fine. So this is what we are trying to show, because lambda f is always finite, and we have to show this. Yeah, so given a k, I have to exhibit an f. So I'm going to show for all k preceding f, I'm going to show that mu k less than or equal to lambda f. I'm showing something more than what we want. Okay. For all k preceding f, if I show mu k is less than or equal to lambda f, because I have something else in mind. I want to do a bit more than saying mu k is finite. So for that, I'm going to show that for all k preceding f, mu k is less than or equal to lambda f. In particular, mu k will be finite.
Sir, this less
Yeah.
than or equal to makes sense if lambda f is a real number. If it is a complex number, it doesn't make sense.
That is true. That is true. So I am going to show. Yeah. So earlier, when I did not come till here, I was, yeah, that's correct. That's correct. But what I was not agreeing with is the point that lambda f is always a real number. That is not true. See, there may be f such that lambda f is a complex number. But then you are right. In our notation, we say less than or equal to only when lambda f is a real number. But then, I did not put the full sentence here. I'm saying that whenever k precedes f, then lambda f has this property. So in other words, whenever k precedes f, this argument, this identity tells you that lambda f is also a real number. Because otherwise we would not have used such an inequality. You are right. Okay. But what I'm not agreeing is that we are only considering real valued linear functions. That is not true. Lambda is a complex linear functional. Lambda f can be a complex number for some arbitrary f. Okay, is that point clear? Here I am saying for k preceding f, for such an f, lambda f is a real number and mu k is less than or equal to that. Okay? Because in this case f is real. In this notation f is automatically real. No. What is the meaning of this notation? This notation is f is in CCX valued, f is valued between 0 and 1, right? So in
Sir,
particular, say it again.
So one more doubt.
Yeah.
So for any open set V, we defined mu of V equal to supremum of lambda f such that f precedes V.
Yes.
So in this case also supremum makes sense if lambda f is that.
Yeah, but that's automatic because you remember the definition of that symbol preceding.
Okay, yes, it is valued in 0 and 1.
It is a real number between 0 and 1. That's part of the definition of preceding. Therefore, all these things are automatically about real numbers. What I did not agree with is that any linear functional on CCX is real valued. I will not agree. That can be a complex number. But we are choosing particular f, and lambda is a positive linear functional. So if f is non-negative real valued, then lambda f is non-negative real is something that we know, and that we are using in all these supremum, infimum, and all that. Because we are always taking f which precedes or succeeds. K precedes f, or f precedes v. And therefore, automatically f is non-negative real valued, and such lambda f is non-negative real valued. Clear?
Yes, sir.
Okay. So now let us continue. So we claim that mu k is less than or equal to lambda f for all k preceding f. So this is what we are going to prove. So let k precedes f. And what do we have to show? We have to show mu k is less than or equal to lambda f, right? Yes. So pick a k which precedes f, and for that k we have to show mu k is less than or equal to lambda f. So what I'm going to do is I'm also going to pick an alpha between 0 and 1 and argue with that. Can you guess what the argument is going to be? You choose an alpha and show something, and what will you do to that alpha in order to get the result? So you're going to show that mu k. Yeah, you will tend alpha to 1. This is typical in various analysis courses, right? Complex analysis also you would have seen. So you will pick such an alpha and somehow you will show that mu k is less than or equal to, what do you think, alpha times lambda f or alpha inverse times lambda f? What am I likely to show? Finally, you have to show it's less than or equal to lambda f. So what do you think I will show? Less than or equal to alpha times lambda f or alpha inverse times lambda f? Now that there is an alpha on the slide.
Alpha times lambda.
Or another candidate is 1 by alpha times lambda f.
In both cases, the quantity goes to 1. So
No. So that is the point to remember. See, I have to use the argument tending to 1 only if it is 1 by alpha times lambda f. No, if it is less than or equal to alpha times lambda f, if I can anyway show, then why should I tend alpha to 1? Because if alpha is half, then half lambda f is anyway less than or equal to lambda f, right? I don't need to tend half to 1, no? Yeah?
yes,
So alpha tending to 1 argument is required only if what you are capable of showing is mu k less than or equal to alpha inverse times lambda f. Because alpha inverse is bigger than 1. So only by alpha tending to 1 you will get this inequality. Okay. So you can guess here itself that we will be showing mu k is less than or equal to alpha inverse times lambda f, and that's what we are going to show. So for that we take, is this the set of x such that fx is bigger than alpha? Now you can visualize this set, right? Fx is valued between 0 and 1. So alpha is strictly less than 1. So there may be, something left between alpha and 1, which f can take. So all those things you take. And what is the most obvious thing about this set that strikes you? V alpha is?
Contains k.
Yeah, okay, that is okay. So there are two things. This contains
K.
This contains k. Why is that? Because f is identically 1 on k and 1 is bigger than alpha. So if fx is, yeah. So if fx is 1, then of course 1 is strictly bigger than alpha. So this contains k, right? If x belongs to k, then this identity is automatically true. So k is contained in V alpha. That's the first striking thing. What is the second striking thing about V alpha topologically? What kind of a set is V alpha?
Open.
Open, because of strict inequality and f is continuous. So this is an open set containing k. And if you have k contained in V alpha, what will you think of? You have a compact set contained in an open set.
Unison lamp.
Yeah, so most likely unison will come. Let us see. So what is the definition of V alpha? Mu of V alpha. Mu of V alpha is supremum of lambda g. G is G precedes V alpha. This is just the definition of mu of V alpha. Okay, and now, yes, now you know how to incorporate alpha. What can you say about alpha g, alpha times g? Alpha times g, so g is supported in V alpha. So Let's see. So I will do so. Okay. So in particular, G precedes V alpha. In particular, G is less than or equal to 1, right? I'm not using V alpha here. Whenever you have the notation precedes, the function is between 0 and 1, no? Agree?
Yes, sir.
Yes, sir.
Now, uh, if G is less than or equal to 1, then alpha G is strictly less than F, right? Because F is less than or equal to 1 anyway. And no, this is not because of G. Sorry, I should not have written like this. This is confusing. What I should write is alpha G is strictly less than F because, no, because of this only. This is also used. Alpha G is strictly less than F because alpha is strictly less than F. And G is less than or equal to 1. Therefore, alpha G is strictly less than F. Agree? This is also used, no? Because if G is much bigger, then it may not be true, right? So alpha is strictly less than F, and if the multiplication is with something less than or equal to 1, then of course alpha G is strictly less than F.
So this inequality holds on V alpha only, right?
This inequality holds only on V alpha, but uh, you see G is no always because G is supported in V alpha. Okay, so outside V alpha anyway G is 0. Therefore, this is true. Is that okay?
Okay, sir.
So inside V alpha,
So,
yeah.
For
but then,
considering f greater than or equal to alpha, it should be V alpha. So
F greater than alpha is inside V alpha. I agree. And that is where alpha G is less than F. But now if you go outside V alpha, then what do you know about G outside V alpha? G is 0, no?
yes, sir.
Yeah, therefore this left hand side is 0, right? Yeah,
but then, sir,
you might say F is
F,
also 0.
yes,
So, so you can do that instead of that strict inequality, you can
Put less than
add
or
less
equal
than
to.
or equal to.
Less than or equal to, then it is always true. So let's see. If I need, I will come back and add, okay? So alpha G is less than F on V alpha and less than or equal to everywhere. That's the conclusion, no? Less than
Yes.
or equal to everywhere, strictly less than on V alpha. Let's see what we are going to use. Okay. So alpha times lambda G is less than lambda F is exactly this inequality lambda applied, nothing more, no? Because lambda is a linear functional. So if it is less than or equal to here, it is less than or equal to here also. Less than or equal to is enough for me. Let us see. Okay. So alpha lambda G is less than lambda F or less than or equal to lambda F, in which case lambda G is less than or equal to alpha inverse lambda F. Okay. So mu of V alpha is supremum of lambda G. G is supported in V alpha. Okay. And lambda G is less than alpha inverse lambda F. So that is true. Lambda G is less than alpha inverse lambda F for all such G, and therefore for the supremum also. So I'm concluding that mu of V alpha is less than alpha inverse lambda F. Now you tell me whether it should be less than or equal to or equal to less than. It should be less than or equal to, right? Because it is supremum over lambda G. Yeah, I guess it's safer to be less than or equal to. Because we are not using just V alpha, we are using values everywhere, no? No, we are using values only in V alpha, right? Because G is supported in V alpha. So outside V alpha, so this supremum, if G is outside if outside V alpha, this is 0, and F also may be 0, but
So you are trying to show that mu of k is less than or equal to lambda f. So if you are not taking less than or equal to, then you will get mu of k less than, strictly less than lambda f.
no, that I will not get. Even the proof that I have written, that I will not get. I will only get less than or equal to. We will see. But let us see at this step. At this step, you are saying that this is true on V alpha. And outside V alpha, you will get both. Outside V alpha, it is possible both are 0. Right? That's the only problem. But
Sir,
yeah.
so why f is 0 outside V alpha?
Why?
Why f is 0 outside V
I'm
alpha?
not saying f is 0. I'm saying g is 0.
G is 0 is clear, but
G is 0, it is clear. But what if g is 0 and f is 0 at some point? That's possible, no?
maybe there is a quantity.
Yeah, maybe that is possible. But does that matter in this identity? If that happens, even then lambda f is not 0, no?
Yes, sir, in the book it is less than or equal to.
That I know. I deliberately changed it thinking that that is not required. That's why I'm thinking again and again. Okay, I remember because I typed only yesterday night. Okay. So, but is it required as in the book? Usually rudeness, correct. So that's why I am going very slow and thinking about it. Okay. But that's not an argument, no? In the book, it is like that is not a good argument, right? We have to see that it is true. Now, my point is, so can you show that this need not be true? That's all that we need to bother about. So alpha g is strictly less than f. If that is true, then this is true. But alpha g is strictly less than f. Yeah, here when I am applying.
So since lambda is monotone, so you can add less than or equal to in the last step also.
No. Please don't misunderstand. That is not my problem. I could have added less than or equal to here itself. No. I could have added less than or equal to here itself, then there's no problem and it will not affect the proof. This is of course true with all that. But since I have made it a point to write strictly less than, I am thinking whether this itself is true. You see my confusion?
Yes, sir.
As far as the proof is concerned, there's no problem. I can put less than or equal to and continue and everything is obvious. But this itself is true is what I thought. And probably I am wrong. But I am not sure even now. So the only way in which this is not true is this is outside V alpha for a point. This is 0. This may be 0, may not be 0, but this is also 0 is possible, in which case it's not strict. So that cannot be ruled out, right? That cannot be ruled out. Therefore, I should put less than or equal to. Therefore, I will put less than or equal to. Therefore, the book is right. And here also less than or equal to, but doesn't matter. So here also less than or equal to doesn't matter. And since k is contained in V alpha, by monotonicity of mu of k is less than or equal to alpha inverse lambda f. Right? Here anyway it is less than or equal to because monotonicity says only that much, no? Less than or equal to alpha inverse lambda f. And now you tend alpha to 1. Now you tend alpha to 1 and what will you get? You will get mu k is less than or equal to lambda f by tending alpha to 1. So what have you got? Yeah, since k is contained in this, mu k is less than or equal to mu of V alpha, which is less than or equal to alpha inverse lambda f. That's how you got this. And by tending alpha to 1, you got this. Okay, so this shows mu k is finite. And we are going to show one more claim, which is about how is mu k and these lambda f, how should they be related? See, everything you have something for open set, there is some reflection in the compact sets. So on open sets, how was mu of open sets and lambda f related? What was the definition of mu of V? It is supremum of lambda f F precedes V. So what should be mu of K? It's kind of the opposite of that. So infimum of, no. Yeah, infimum of lambda F, K precedes F. Okay, so that also we are going to show. We claim that mu of K is infimum of lambda F, K precedes F, but we have already shown something. What did we show? We show that for all K precedes F, mu K is less than or equal to lambda F. So taking infimum makes sense, and you should get it by taking infimum. So do you agree that, so you know that mu K is less than or equal to lambda F for all K precedes F. So what is the extra thing that we are claiming? It is actually the infimum. So mu K is a lower bound is already proved, right? Mu K is a lower bound for that set is already proved, right?
Yes, sir.
So what do we need to prove now? It is the
Greatest
infimum. It is the greatest lower bound. So something greater is not a lower bound. That's all that we need to show. Something greater is not a lower bound. So we need to show that mu K plus something is not a lower bound. So mu K is also infimum of mu of V, K contained in V, V open, right? This is the definition for any set. Any arbitrary set E, this was the definition of mu of E. So in particular for this. So, so mu K plus epsilon is not a lower bound for mu V's, right? Mu K plus something is not a lower bound for these mu V's. So there exists a V such that mu V is strictly less than mu K plus epsilon. You agree? From this definition. From this definition. Mu K plus something is not a lower bound. So there is a V such that mu V is strictly less than mu K plus epsilon. Yeah. So yes.
Yes, sir.
And we have to show that mu K plus epsilon is not a lower bound for lambda F with K preceding F. Mu K plus epsilon is not a, so I would like to get K preceding F and lambda F is less than mu K plus epsilon. Now can you finish the proof? I've got a K contained in V and I have to exhibit an F now so that lambda F is strictly less than mu K plus epsilon. I leave it for you to finish the proof. I've got a V such that mu V is less than mu K plus epsilon, but I'm interested in getting an F such that lambda F is less than mu K plus epsilon. What do you do? One word. Just one word.
Use Urison's lemma.
Urison. So how will you apply Urison? Where will you apply Urison? For K contained in V.
Yes.
For K contained in V, if you apply Urison, you will get an F such that K precedes F precedes V, no?
Yes, sir.
But because F precedes V, what is the relationship between lambda F and mu V? Mu V is the supremum. So lambda F is less than mu V. So that finishes the job. So we have some info about this and we need some info in terms of K precedes F. Apply Urison and you are done, right? So this F, the F that you choose so that K precedes F precedes V. If you take that F, then K precedes F is there and F precedes V is also there. And from that you will get lambda F is less than mu V. And that finishes the proof. Okay, so this we will use later. Next step is about open sets. So once we had compact, next thing is about open, and open sets are inner regular. That is the next claim, right? Finally, we are going to show that any set of finite measures is inner regular and open sets are also inner regular. So this step we are going to show that open sets are inner regular. This is easy. We need to show that an open set can be approximated from below using compact sets. This is what we need to show. By monotonicity, right? We have proved monotonicity for mu, no? That we did at the very starting. So if K is contained in V, then mu K is less than or equal to mu V. So mu V is an upper bound is clear. It's just monotonicity, right? So what do we need to show? We need to show that it is the least among the upper bounds. Yes? You have to say something, only then I can continue.
Yes, sir.
Yeah, so we have to show that it's the least among the upper bounds. So take alpha less than mu v, and we have to show that alpha is not an upper bound, right? If alpha is strictly less than mu v, you have to show that alpha is not an upper bound. So we need to exhibit k such that alpha is strictly less than mu k. That's enough, right?
Yeah.
That's enough. So alpha is, so we have to exhibit a k. So how do we do that? Now mu v is given in terms of sup of lambda f precedes v, and we have to exhibit a k. Now this is the definition of mu v. After all, it's about open sets and it's about inner regularity. So mu is involved, and therefore you have to look at mu v. That is natural. And this is the definition of mu v. And you have to get a compact set. Do you see a compact set in the slide?
Yes, sir. Alpha is less than mu v, so there is
Yes, alpha is less
F
than mu
preceding
v.
v.
So alpha is, yes. So therefore you will get an F, right?
Yes, yes.
Therefore you will get an F such that F preceding V such that alpha is strictly less than lambda F. But you're not interested in F, you're interested in a compact set. Do you see a
We'll
compact
take
set?
support of F.
Let us see, because that's the only thing that we can do now, right? Whether it works or not is another matter, but what else is there to try? So try support of F. So the obvious associated compact set is support of F, and if alpha is strictly less than mu k, then good. Okay, so let's try. So alpha is less than lambda F, we know, and you have k, and let us take let us look at mu k. Okay, so if W is open such that W contains k, then what does this mean? If W is open such that W contains k, then support of F is contained in W. In other words, F is preceding W, right? Because k is support of F. In terms of F, if your W is open such that W contains k, in this notation, F precedes W. And you have the definition of mu of W as sup of lambda F, F precedes W. And from this, what can you conclude? What do you know about lambda F? Alpha is strictly less than lambda F. Alpha is strictly less than lambda F. So what can you conclude? This is the least upper bound. So alpha is no. Alpha is mu w is an upper bound for all lambda f, right? It's a least upper bound. In particular, it's an upper bound. So lambda f is less than or equal to no. What is the relationship? Mu w is an upper bound, no? So lambda f is less than or equal to mu w, right?
Yes.
For all f precedes w, and alpha is less than lambda f. So alpha is less than this is true.
Mu of
Therefore,
W.
alpha is less than. Okay, so maybe one more argument. So lambda f is less than or equal to mu w, and this is true for any open set w containing k. This is true for any open set W containing K. So what can you conclude? You can make W smaller and smaller containing K, and take a guess. We will see whether it's correct or not. What do you like to guess here?
By definition of mu, this implies lambda of f is less than mu of k.
Is that correct? What is your proof?
Because mu of k is equal to infimum of all open sets, measure of infimum of all open sets containing k.
Yes. Yes.
So
It
yes,
is correct. So from this you can conclude lambda f is less than or equal to mu k, because mu k is infimum of mu w, right? Mu k is infimum of mu w. That's what you're using, no?
Yes, sir.
Mu k is infimum of mu w, w containing k, open. And for any open set, this is true. Lambda f is less than or equal to mu w. So mu k is the infimum. Yes, so if lambda f is bigger than mu k, you would have got a w says that this is not true. Therefore, this is true. And yeah, this is exactly what you told me. And now we already know from the previous slide that alpha is less than lambda f. And because lambda f is less than or equal to mu k, you got alpha is strictly less than mu k. That's what you wanted, right? If you take something strictly less than mu k, then it's not an upper bound. If you take something strictly less than, what was the claim? Claim is that lambda or mu of k is infimum of lambda f. So if you take something strictly less than lambda f, that is not an upper bound. That is not a lower bound. No. What did we want? We wanted to show that alpha, if you take alpha to be, yeah, you have, yeah, inner regularity. So we wanted to show that this is, yeah, monotonicity, mu v is an upper bound. We want to show this is the least. So if something lower, if you take, you wanted to show that it is not an upper bound, which means there is case as alpha less than mu k, and that's what we have shown. So what's the main point? You interpret it in terms of mu v, interpret it in terms of f, and from that you get an f and argue with its support. And that support itself does the job. You don't have to do anything else, but that requires a proof, and that is given. Okay, so this is step 3. Can you just tell me the time? I have one more 12:11, so we have time. So I can do the last step today. So this is okay. So we have shown additive, subadditivity. We have shown compact sets have finite measure, and we have shown open sets are inner regular. And now we are going to show additivity, but only on MF. Okay, additivity we will show only on MF. And what did I recall when we were doing step 1? I talked about step 4, right? And the idea is we have to do something for compact sets, 2 compact sets. In step 1 for subadditivity, the starting point was for open sets. We proved this. Similarly, the starting point is this. Mu of k1 union k2 is mu of k1 plus mu of k2 when
K1, K2 are compact is
k1, k2 are disjoint compact sets. So if k1 and k2 are disjoint compact sets, standard application of Urysohn, right? If k1 and k2 are disjoint sets, disjointness tells you what? K1 is contained in
K2 complement.
or K2 is contained in K1 complement. Take one of those. K1 is contained in K2 complement. And what is K2 complement topologically?
Open.
Open.
Because K2 is closed. And compact is closed. And everything is good because we are in a Hausdorff space. So K1 contained in K2 complement is compact contained in open. And therefore you will apply Urysohn, and you will get an F such that K1 precedes F precedes K2 complement. But K1 precedes F, meaning F is identically 1 on K1, right? And F precedes K2 complement means what? Support of F is contained in K2 complement. So what is the value of F on K2?
0.
So this is the way in which, I was saying Urysohn's lemma is also about separating things. So, in fact, it's much better than separating points. It's actually separating 2 closed sets. Urysohn lemma immediate corollary is that you can construct continuous functions separating 2 closed sets. Okay. So this we discussed in terms of great profusion, right? Continuous functions exist in great profusion. So disjointness gives this, and compact contained in open Urysohn, and you will get an F such that F is between 0 and 1, and this happens. This means F separates K1 and K2. F is identically 1 on K1 and F is identically 0 on K2. Okay. Now this is very similar to step 1. Step 1, what did we do? We got H1 and H2 and we argued with H1G plus H2G, etc. Right? Something similar here. F is identically 1 and F is identically 0. So F is identically 0 meaning which function is identically 1? 1 minus F is identically 1. Right? So using all this, see, basically, you want to apply the linear functional lambda. So if you can write something as sum of two things or scalar multiple, etc., you can apply lambda and conclude something. This is the key idea. So F is identically 1 on K1, identically 0 on K2. And how is lambda connected with compact sets? So in step 2, we had a connection between lambda and compact sets, right? What did we prove? In step 2, we proved that mu of K equal to
infimum of lambda.
Infimum of lambda if K precedes F. Okay, so keep this in mind, and we are going to apply this to K1 union K2. That's also compact, no? Finite union of compact sets is compact. So we are going to apply this to K1 union K2. So I'm interested in mu of K1 union K2. So I should be looking at lambda G where K1 union K2 precedes G, right? So I'm going to apply mu of K1 union K2 is the greatest lower bound. So mu of K1 union K2 plus something is not a lower bound. So this is not a lower bound for this set. Lambda G K1 union K2 precedes G. Agree? By the definition of mu of K1 union K2. Agree?
Yes,
now,
sir.
This means G is identically 1 on K1 union K2, right?
Yeah.
So that means G is identically 1 on K1 and G is identically 1 on K2, right?
Yeah.
So K1 precedes G, K2 also precedes G. Yes?
Yes.
But do you agree that K1 precedes FG? F is this.
Yes, sir.
F is 1 on K1. So K1 precedes
Yes.
FG. And what precedes, K2 precedes what in terms of F and G? K2 precedes
1 minus F.
1 minus F times G. Okay.
G.
So we have K1 union K2. So from this, yeah, we are going to come to that step. But here, this is not a lower bound for this. And because of that, you will get a K1 union K2. No, you will get a G. K1 union K2 precedes G, and what is the next sentence? It's not a lower bound. So you will get a G such that
Lambda of
lambda G
G
is
less than
strictly less than mu of K1 union K2 plus epsilon. Now you're going to do the following. Horizon function F you have. It's 1 on K1 and 0 on K2. And you have K1 precedes Fg and K2 precedes 1 minus Fg. And therefore, mu of K1 is less than or equal to lambda of Fg. Agree? Because of this again, no? Mu of K is a lower bound. So mu of K1 is less than or equal to lambda of Fg, and mu of K2 is less than or equal to lambda of 1 minus F times G, which is G minus Fg. Yeah. So now we can do mu of K1 plus mu of K2, right? So mu of K1 plus mu of K2 is, what can you say, less than or equal to lambda of Fg plus lambda of G minus Fg. Agree? Lambda of Fg plus lambda of G minus Fg. Lambda is linear. So that is Fg plus G minus Fg. So lambda of G. And lambda of G, what is the choice of G? Choice of G is such that lambda G is less than mu of K1 union K2 plus epsilon. So lambda G is less than mu of K1 union K2 plus epsilon. This is true for all epsilon. So what do you get? You get this. This is enough, no?
Yes, sir.
Why is this enough?
Reverse is already in one.
We have shown already
First
subadditivity. We
Yes.
have already shown subadditivity, and therefore this is true. Right? Subadditivity we have shown for any countable union. So in particular for union of two sets. Okay, so this shows the first step. Now what do we need to show? We have to show, suppose EIs are pairwise disjoint members of MF. Okay, only on MF we are claiming right now. Later we will show on M. But MF is in terms of compact sets, inner regular. And we have shown something for compact sets that will be useful. So EIs are pairwise disjoint members. We have to show, take E to be the union. We have to show this. Agree? This is what we need to show. By step 1, you have subadditivity. And therefore, if mu E is infinite, you have already shown. Agree? Because if this is infinite, then this has to be an equality because left hand side is infinite. So you can assume that mu of E is finite. You can assume that mu of E is finite, and sets of MF are inner regular. What are there in MF? E or EI? What is given? EIs are in MF. Do we know E is in MF?
No, sir.
No, there's nothing like that. Okay. But we are going to show E is also in MF provided mu of E is finite. We will show that. Okay, right now we don't know. But EIs are in MF. EIs are in MF. Therefore, mu of EI is supremum of mu of K because by definition MF consists of inner regular sets. So this is given to us. And we are going to do that epsilon argument. Mu of EI minus something is not an upper bound. It's not an upper bound for this set, this collection. Therefore, you will get a K, right? Compact such that something happens. So we are going to do that for each EI. So let epsilon be positive and there exists compact sets HI contained in EI such that earlier, in step 1 we took mu of something plus epsilon by 2 power I. You remember? Similarly, here you will take something minus epsilon by 2 power I. So you will take mu of EI minus epsilon by 2 power I, and that is not an upper bound. So corresponding to that, you will get a compact set which you are calling HI. It is not an upper bound. So mu of HI, yeah, this is not an upper bound. So mu of EI minus epsilon by 2 power I is strictly less than mu of HI. Agree?
Yes,
Yeah.
sir.
And there, what was the next step? In the next step, we had to have a finite union, right? So we took an infinite union and we had to come to a finite union. How did we achieve that in that step? Because only finitely we could have added. Subadditivity we could have used. So we took an F which precedes that V and use the compactness of support of F in order to get a finite union, right?
Yes.
And here we don't need to do that because we will argue with, so we will introduce, H1 union, etc. We will take a finite union of HIs and argue with that. So this we have, keep this in mind. And now we are going to take a finite union, H1, etc. Hn, call it Kn. And this is contained in E1 union, etc. En, no? Because each HI is contained in EI and that is contained in E because E is the arbitrary union. E is the full union. So you have Kn contained in E and therefore mu of E is bigger than or equal to mu of Kn, right? Why is that? It's just monotonicity, nothing more. Because E contains Kn, mu of E is bigger than or equal to mu of Kn. And what do you know about mu of Kn?
Additivity holds.
Additivity holds for disjoint compact sets. Why are the HIs disjoint? Why is H1 and H2 disjoint?
HIs are contained in EI and EI are disjoint.
Correct. And EI is a disjoint. Therefore, this is true. And what did we show about mu of HI? Mu of HI is bigger than mu of EI minus epsilon by 2 power I. Therefore, this is bigger than mu of E1 plus etc. plus mu of En minus epsilon of 1 by 2 plus 1 by 4 plus etc. Finite sum. But 1 by 2 plus 1 by 4 etc. is less than 1. Therefore, minus of that is bigger than minus 1. Therefore, you can put minus epsilon. Okay. This is true for what? This is true for all n, no? I could have taken any n here, right? Any finite n, this is true. So this is true for all n and this is true for all epsilon. So what is your conclusion? Your conclusion is that mu of E is bigger than or equal to summation mu of EI. Because this is true for all n and for all epsilon. And that's enough because of subadditivity. Subadditivity we have shown earlier. Therefore, mu of E is mu of EI. We are going to show one more thing and then we will stop, which is the question is MF closed under countable unions. We don't know, but what we are going to show is if mu of E is finite, then that is true. Okay, so what we are going to claim is E is arbitrary. E is union of disjoint sets EI. EIs are in MF. Then we are going to show that E is also in MF, provided mu of E is finite. Because anyway, you know, by definition, MF should have something with finite measure, no? MF had two conditions. One is irregularity and one is finiteness of measure. So if mu of E is finite, we are going to show that E is irregular. That's what we have to show. So for every epsilon positive, there exists an N such that mu of E is less than or equal to this. Why is this true? Because we know that mu E is the infinite sum of mu EI, right? That is a limit of partial sums. So the partial sum summation 1 to n mu EI converges to mu E. So apply the epsilon definition of limit. So for every epsilon, there is a stage capital N beyond which the difference is small. So that means this is true. And this is less than mu of Kn plus 2 epsilon. Why is that? That is because of the previous step. So summation mu EI minus epsilon is bigger than Kn, right? Summation mu En minus epsilon is less than mu of Kn. So this is less than mu of Kn plus epsilon. So mu of this is less than mu of Kn plus epsilon and one more epsilon. So this is less than mu of Kn plus 2 epsilon. This shows E is irregular. Why? Because why does this show E is irregular? Because you have exhibited a compact set. Kn is a compact set. What do we need to show for irregularity? Mu E is supremum of mu K contained in E, right? Because K is contained in E, you want to show that mu E is supremum of mu K, no?
Yeah.
So it is an upper bound and it is the least upper bound. It is an upper bound is clear, no? Because if K is contained in E, then mu E is bigger than mu K by monotonicity. So you only need to show that it is the least upper bound. So if you take something smaller than mu E minus epsilon, you have to show that it is not an upper bound. So you have to exhibit a compact set such that mu E minus epsilon is less than mu of K. And that's what you have done. Mu E minus 2 epsilon is strictly less than mu of a compact set. Agree? So we showed that E is irregular. And in other words, countable union of disjoint sets of MF belong to MF if it's of finite measure. Anyway, finite measure is required. That's part of the definition of MF. So irregularity is true. For countable union of disjoint sets of MF, irregularity is true. Okay, I think it's a good point to stop. And this is my last slide. So how many steps are remaining? I can stop sharing. How many steps are remaining?
6
steps. So let us try to do 3 or 4 steps in the next class and the remaining in the next class. Okay. And any question? Maybe I can stop the recording also. Yeah, so I will stop the recording.